The 8,839th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. I now give the floor to Mr. Davood Moradian, who I believe was in Kabul till a few days ago. Mr. Moradian, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, Honorable Minister Jaishankar, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to have the opportunity to share with this August forum my perspective on the threat of Daesh to international peace and security. In light of the unfolding catastrophe and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, I will also bring in the Afghan tragedy and factors in the context of today's briefing. In less than 3 weeks, the world would witness and commemorate the tragic and painful 20th anniversary of 9/11 terrorist attack, which gave birth to our collective struggle against terrorism. The fact that the UN Security Council held a regular session on Daesh in August 2021 is a testimony that the world has collectively failed to deal with the threat of terrorism after 20 years and despite allocating abundant resources in blood and treasure. And I would like to offer my reflection and analysis on some reason for our collective failures. I would begin from my own field, the academic world. There is hardly any reasonable consensus and intellectual agreements on the very definition and understanding of terrorism. The diversity of names and labels to describe militant Islamist movement indicate this conceptual confusion. Names such as jihadists, Salafi, fundamentalists, Islamic terrorists, extremists, violent extremists, Islamofascists, insurgent, barbarian, terrorists, foreign terrorists, international terrorism, and some other names and labels are used. The failure of the Islamic world to own its share of responsibility is the other important reason for our collective failure. While the bulk of terrorist perpetrator and victim have been Muslim, sadly the Islamic world has remained passive observer in our narrative about an existential threat to Muslims' well-being and security. The intellectual and political stagnation of religious, cultural, and educational institutions have immensely contributed to the rise of extremism and the failures of defensive measures against this threat in the Islamic world. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring in the role of the most privileged member of the international system, as you call member states, in our collective failures. The overwhelming approach to terrorism has been to treat terrorism as a non-state phenomenon and independent from a state-centric international system. In reality, however, terrorism is a product of the state system, and one or other states tend to be behind or above a given terrorist group. In some cases, there are a group of like-minded states that support a group, as was the case with the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Daesh would not have survived and flourished had it not been for the support that it received from some member states. Sadly, the UN system protects its guilty members who engage in proxy war against a regional and global adversary by utilizing terrorism as a state policy. The disconnection between UN analytical reports and UN political statement and action show the UN's incapability to confront a state sponsorship of terrorism. Our global struggle against terrorism can be also compared and contrasted with our other global struggle against COVID-19 pandemic. In our recent struggle, we have witnessed the phenomenon of vaccine nationalism, which the rich nation choose self-interest over collective interests. Despite the rhetoric of fighting all forms of terrorism, sadly, many governments have chosen to focus on their own terrorists rather than the integrated nature of global terrorism. The case of Afghanistan is a prime example of the contradictory approach to deal with terrorism. Many have been recommending political means to deal with the Taliban, while advocating military solution to other like-minded groups such as Al-Qaeda, Daesh, Pakistani Taliban, and the ETIM. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a utility and wisdom in a political approach to the Taliban, why should not it be extended to other groups or the other way around? All these groups share fundamental characteristics with one another, despite differences in the scope of their activity. Again, using the COVID-19 analogy, they are variants of the same original phenomenon, which have been mutated to different degree of lethality and version, as with the alpha, beta, and delta variants. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, terrorism, 9/11, and Afghanistan have become defining name in global conversation about terrorism. The takeover of Kabul by the Taliban on the eve of the 20th anniversary of 9/11 would be remembered as a historic benchmark and a turning point. It is natural to be fascinated by the symbolic coincidence of the two anniversary or intellectual discussion about the definition of terrorism, or to engage in political debate about blame game. But what we must focus now is the humanitarian dimension and the unfolding catastrophe. As Honorable Minister stated, I was at Kabul airport when desperate passengers held departing US airplanes, and also my own airplane that was due to leave Kabul airport. It was sheer human desperation, helplessness, and fear. One of the passengers that fell to the ground from a flying US airplane was reportedly a member of Afghanistan national football team. These passengers were not alone in their desperation and fear. They represent millions of Afghans from diverse backgrounds, from women's rights activists to destitute farmers. The world must intervene to avert and mitigate an apocalyptic humanitarian tragedy. And to this end, the UN must overcome its usual approach by declaring the situation as urgent humanitarian crisis under the Chapter 7 provision of the United Nations Charter. This should include serious and urgent deliberation to declare Kabul as safe zone, protected by a UN peacekeeping mission. This would allow the opposing faction to come to an inclusive political settlement while working to mitigate the unfolding catastrophe. I use the word of catastrophe very intentionally because I was in a very catastrophic situation in Kabul just 48 hours ago. So it's not an exaggeration when I make reference to when I use the word of catastrophe, which also was used by UN Secretary General in recent reports to the Council. The crisis of Afghanistan during the last 4 decades has shown that a military solution is just a brief pause to the next phase of the war. The Taliban and their regional partners, particularly the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, should reflect on their principal role in either mitigating or accelerating a catastrophic situation in Afghanistan, an outcome that will determine our decades-old against terrorism. And I thank you all for your listening. Thank you, Mr. President and ladies and gentlemen.
I thank Mr. Moradian for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Minister of